Today, we're going to unravel the incredible story of feminist ethics. It's a story about how a really powerful idea came to be, how it got challenged in a major way, and how it ended up changing how we think about morality itself. So let's just start with a huge question. What if the way we think about right and wrong, the stuff that feels so universal and obvious, actually has a massive blind spot? What if it's all been built on a very specific and maybe even biased point of view? And what if there's a completely different way to look at ethics that's been hiding in plain sight all along?
All right, to get what's going on here, we have to look at the old guard, the giants of traditional ethics. For centuries, philosophers were on this quest to build the perfect moral system, one that was totally impartial, with universal rules that applied to everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. But what if that noble goal, that search for impartiality, was the problem itself?
And here, you can see the clash in a nutshell. On one side, you have these big theories like utilitarianism and Kantianism. They love abstract, universal principles. But on the other side, feminist critics started pointing out some major flaws. For one, this obsession with impartiality just doesn't jive with real life. I mean, your obligations to your kids are different from your obligations to a stranger, right? But the even bigger issue, and this is the real bombshell, is that the data these grand theories were built on came from a ridiculously biased sample, pretty much just men. And that meant that the experiences common to women's lives were just, well, they were ignored or treated as less important. So this critique didn't just stay in the classroom, it absolutely exploded into a whole field of research, thanks in large part to the work of a psychologist named Lawrence Kohlberg and his brilliant student and colleague, Gilligan. What they uncovered really set the stage for a radical new way of thinking. So Kohlberg comes up with this hugely influential model. He called it the ladder of moral development. The idea was that everyone, everywhere, climbs these 6 steps. You start at the bottom, just trying to avoid punishment, and you work your way all the way up to the top to stage 6, where you're reasoning with these beautiful, abstract, universal ethical principles. That was considered the absolute peak of moral thinking. But here's where things get weird. When Kohlberg and his team ran their studies, they found this really strange and, frankly, controversial pattern. It seemed that girls and women consistently got stuck at stage 3, the good girl stage of interpersonal conformity. Because they tended to prioritize relationships, loyalty, and not hurting people's feelings over abstract rules, the study's conclusion was that they were, well, morally underdeveloped, stuck. Yeah, you can imagine that finding didn't sit well with a lot of people. So how did Kohlberg test this? He used these tricky hypothetical scenarios, and this one, the Heinz dilemma, is the most famous of them all. The logic you used to justify your answer was everything. That's what determined where you landed on his moral ladder.
And the answers from 2 11-year-olds in the study just say it all. You have Jake, who looks at this like a math problem. There's a conflict between life and property. He does the calculation and concludes life is more valuable. Boom. It's a logical proof. He scores high, stage 4 or 5. But then there's Amy, and she does something totally different. She doesn't accept the problem as it's given. She tries to find another way, talking to the pharmacist, borrowing money, finding a creative solution so nobody gets hurt and no relationships are broken. From Kohlberg's perspective, she was failing to make a clear moral choice. She got scored at stage 3.
But then Gilligan steps in and says, hold on a second. What if we're looking at this all wrong? She argued that Amy wasn't less developed. She was just speaking in a different voice. She wasn't playing Jake's game of abstract justice. She was playing an entirely different but equally valid game of care. The moral world Gilligan proposed wasn't the single ladder. It had 2 different but equally important languages. And this idea, this different voice, was way too big to stand psychology. It was picked up by philosophers like Noddings, and they developed it into a full-blown ethical theory, one that would seriously challenge the foundations of Western philosophy, the ethics of care. So, what is the ethics of care? Well, in a nutshell, it's a theory that puts relationships and responsibilities to others right at the center of morality, instead of abstract rules. The key idea here is that being moral is about responding to the specific needs of other people in a specific situation, not about applying some cold, one-size-fits-all principle from a rule book.
This approach just completely reframes the whole picture. So forget about rigid, universal rules. The ethics of care says real life is just way too messy and complicated for that. It says that the fact that we depend on each other isn't some weakness we need to overcome. It's the very fabric of our moral lives. And, this is crucial, it is proudly not impartial. It says our obligations to our friends and family should be different than our obligations to strangers.
So, for a good decade or so, the ethics of care was the dominant idea in feminist ethics. It was a huge deal. But then, a really serious, troubling criticism started to bubble up, and it was coming from inside the feminist movement itself.
And people started to ask, is this really the answer? By celebrating an ethic based on caring for others, being receptive to their needs, were we accidentally walking right into an old trap? Could this focus on care actually lead to a dangerous pattern of total self-sacrifice?
The best way to understand this critique is through Virginia Woolf's incredible metaphor, the angel in the house. This angel was the perfect woman of the Victorian era. She was sweet, she was charming, and she was completely, utterly unselfish. She always took the worst piece of chicken, always sat in the drafty spot. She never had a thought or a wish for herself. For Woolf, a woman had to kill the angel to ever be free or creative. And that really gets to the heart of the worry. Could the ethics of care, despite all its good intentions, actually be a step backward? The fear was that by celebrating a traditionally feminine way of being, it was just reinforcing the very stereotypes that feminists had been fighting for decades. You know, the idea that women are the emotional caregivers and men are the rational thinkers who get to run the world. So this created a massive dilemma. Do you throw away the powerful insights of care ethics just because they might be misused? Or do you risk propping up old, damaging stereotypes? The answer, as it turned out, was a lot more interesting and nuanced than just picking a side.
The big breakthrough was realizing it wasn't an either-or choice. The goal wasn't to pick justice or care. It was to build a system that valued both. People began to see that care without justice can lead to exploitation and burnout, while justice without care can be cold, rigid, and blind to what people actually need.
And this led to this incredible flowering of new, much more sophisticated ideas. Philosophers started updating old theories for this new world. You had people like Gene Hampton arguing that, hey, we actually need impartiality and fairness, especially inside families, to prevent abuse. Marcia Homiak pointed out that even a virtue like kindness has to be guided by reason. Otherwise, you might just be enabling a toxic relationship. And thinkers like Susan Moller-Ocken just blew up the whole idea of a private world for women and a public world for men. As you can see, feminist ethics moved way beyond a simple debate between two opposing sides.
And that leaves us right here with the huge ongoing question that feminist ethics is still wrestling with today. It's not about picking sides between a cold, rigid justice and a potentially self-sacrificing care. The real work is figuring out how to weave them together in our laws, in our communities, and yeah, in our own daily lives. The challenge isn't just to figure out what's right, but to build a world where both our rational minds and our caring hearts can truly flourish. So, what does that world look like to you?